Hi, so welcome to the next session for YA ThrillerCon. I'm really delighted to be chatting with some amazing fantasy fiction authors and industry professionals today. So we've got this exciting panel planned, lots of questions all about fantasy fiction. And yeah, I'm just so excited to be here chatting with you all. And this is a live broadcast as well. So if you are watching live and you want to ask a question to any of our panelists, you can send that question in to us. And at the end, we will be answering your questions. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can use the live chat facility and send your question directly to us. If you're watching on Facebook, leave a comment and we will get your question too. And if you're watching on Twitter, just tweet us the question and I'll be checking the Twitter account, which is at YA ThrillerCon, at the end of the panel as well. So we'll get everyone's questions in and then we'll select as many as we can to answer during the time that we have. So let's welcome my amazing panelists. So first up, we have Jessica. So would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jessica Lewis. I'm an Alabama author, and I also am a receptionist, but I write books by night. My current YA is Bad Witch Burning, which came out in August 2021, and I also write middle grade contemporary under my pen name Jazz Taylor. So nice to meet everybody.
It's lovely to meet you, and I'm a massive fan of Bad Witch Burning. It's one of my favourite fantasy YA novels that I've read recently. So I'm so excited that you're here and I get to chat with you and I get to soak up all the wisdom that you're going to be giving us all. So next up, we have Emily. So would you like to introduce yourself as well, please?
Sure. So, hi, everyone. Maddie, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here. And Jessica, I love that title, Bad Witch Burning. That's awesome. Now I feel like I want to run out and snap it right up as soon as we're done with the panel. So I'm from Brooklyn, New York, but I live in North Carolina. I have for quite a while. I like to say that even though I write for adults and young adults, everything I write can be boiled down to a love story with a supernatural twist. Sometimes it's a supernatural story with a love twist. I don't know. So yeah, for adults, I write romantic women's fiction that always has some kind of supernatural element. And then for young adults, I've done a couple of anthologies, including one with Maddie. But I also am in the midst of writing the third book in my series, which is called The Seven Sins. So yeah, that is what I write. And then I also teach writing and I edit books as well. That's me.
What a great introduction, Emily. So yeah, thank you so much for telling us all about you and your work. I'm a massive fan of your series as well, as I'm sure you know. So yeah, next up we have Nancy. So would you like to introduce yourself as well, please?
Yeah. So can you hear me actually? Okay.
Yeah.
So I am Nancy Wu, and I'm an actor narrator. And I was first in New York City as an actor and somehow fell into audiobook narration. I had done voiceover before as I was on a Nickelodeon cartoon for a season, years ago. And then I just kind of fell into this work at the time in New York City 10, 15 years ago. And luckily, I was able to kind of stay in it through all sorts of life changes. And it's an incredible thing to be able to do is to read y'all's work. And especially, I love YA fantasy and adult fantasy, thriller, and paranormal kind of stuff, speculative fiction. I have the most fun when I do these kind of different worlds, and really we're kind of performing. I guess lots of you have listened to these audiobooks. I did the Avatar: The Last Airbender series, which I just completed the third book. This is based on the Nickelodeon show. I don't know if you guys watch that. I guess that's my favorite one. Of course, it's like a big deal because there's such a huge fan base for Avatar, and you know, Christian Yee's done a great job writing that series, and it's incredible when you create a big world that, like all of you have this huge task when you're doing that. So appreciate all the good work everybody does.
Thank you, Nancy. So yeah, I'm definitely interested to be chatting with you and like learning a bit more about the narration work that you do, and especially sort of that side of the book industry, because obviously I'm a YA author and I'm very much on the writing side. So really interesting to chat with you as well. And we also have Bryony. So Bryony, would you like to introduce yourself and your work now, please?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep, sound is good.
Great. So yeah, hi. I'm afraid I'm in a hotel room and the Wi-Fi is not as good as I was hoping it would be. So I'm gonna hope that I stay. So yeah, I'm Bryony. I've been published for just over a decade. I started off writing young adult fiction and still do. I've had 10, I think, young adult books published. My most recent one, Raising Hell, is an urban fantasy, but I also write young adult horror, paranormal, dystopia, that sort of thing. And then I also write adult thrillers. I've had 2 of those published, and short stories that are crime or science fiction. I was just longlisted for a CWA Dagger Award. So I also teach creative writing. I work for City University teaching a course on how to write for young people. And yeah, I mentor, I work for Cornerstones and the Writing Coach doing reports and mentoring aspiring writers. So yeah, a little bit of lots of things really.
Wonderful. And yeah, my current read is actually Raising Hell, so I'm so excited to be chatting with you as well.
Are you enjoying it?
I am. Yeah, it's so engaging. So I'm really excited to sort of like keep reading it once this panel has finished. But yeah, so excited to chat with you all as well. So a quick introduction about me. I'm Madeline Dyer. I founded YA Thrillercon 3 years ago now. So this is a 3rd year. Delighted to still be running it and like chatting with so many authors. I write YA dystopian and YA thrillers, and some of my dystopian books have like this fantasy world building in, and I also teach writing as well. So let's get starting with the panel questions, because I've got this whole list of questions lined up that I absolutely must ask you all, and then I'm going to be writing so many notes after this about all the little gems of wisdom you're going to give me, and then I'm just going to sort of soak it all up and make my writing even better, because I am talking with you and you're the masters at this. So how did you get into the writing industry or the book industry? So I'm going to pick one of you to start answering this, and then hopefully it will evolve into a nice organic conversation between the 5 of us. So Jessica, let's start with you.
So my first writing endeavor was actually in middle school. My friends were really into fan fiction at the time, and I guess it was my first IP gig because they wanted me to write some self-insert fan fiction for them, but I had never seen the show that they liked. So they described the characters to me, and then I just, did my best. So that was my first writing experience. But I decided to do my own stories in high school, and then in college, I actually got serious about publishing and looking up agents and getting beta reader feedback and stuff like that. So college was my for real attempt, but I've been writing for a very long time.
Awesome. So Bryony, what was your sort of like pathway into the industry then?
I think I was a bit older. So I'd been working in London for about 6 years, and I desperately wanted to write, but I was feeling a bit stuck. So I did a short story writing course with the London School of Journalism on the basis that they would give me homework, and I thought, if I had homework, I would write. So I wrote a bunch of short stories, and one of them I thought had legs. So I thought, let's give it a go and try and write a novel. And at that time, I had no thoughts about taking it any further or getting published. I just wanted to do it for fun and see if I could, which I think took a lot of pressure off me as a writer. So I then wrote the novel, and I left London and carried on writing, really. And then what happened was I finished it, and I thought, you know what? this isn't quite, I really like this. So I sent it to Cornerstones, who are a literary consultancy, who you pay and they tell you what's working, what's not. And they suggested that I entered the SCBWI Undiscovered Voices competition in 2008, which I then won. And from there, I got an agent, and from there, a book deal, and so on and so forth. But yes, I was very much out of college by the time I did all of that.
Oh, that's so interesting hearing, and like, yeah, well done. Like winning that competition just sounds like it sort of like opened up so many doors for you. Yeah. So Emily, what was your process like into the book industry?
I think my process was a little strange because it was sort of a girl interrupted kind of a story. I always wrote when I was little. In fact, in 4th grade, I wrote this story that had sort of racy bits in it after reading Judy Blume's Forever, and it got circulated all around 4th grade, and everyone was reading it, you know, in the bathroom and like behind Spiral, Trapper Keepers, whatever. And I wrote and wrote and wrote all the way kind of through college, and I decided to major in something else in college because I had done so much time writing. I thought I really want to try something new. But I did take one creative writing class in college, and that creative writing teacher was awful. Oh, he was so mean to me in particular because what I wrote was popular. It was genre fiction. And this was, you know, a fancy university and a fancy man and a fancy seminar room. And I had gone to a public university in New York City where it was all about good writing is good writing no matter who writes it. It didn't matter if it was a supermarket paperback or some highfalutin whatever, we judged it on the base of the writing. So I didn't have that, I don't want to say insecurity or snobbery, I don't know, neither one of those is quite the right word, but I didn't have that built-in piece to feel self-conscious about what I liked. And so when we went around the room at the beginning and named one of our favorite authors, speaking of fantasy, I said Anne Rice. And you could have heard a pin drop, and the man, there's an awful silence fell. I think everyone else wanted to slide under the table, and the man turned his head real slowly like in a horror movie, and he looked at me and he said, I see. And the whole rest of the semester, anytime anyone wrote anything that he viewed to be subpar, the same silence would fall, and he'd turn to me and he'd say, what do you think, Anne Rice? And it made me so self-conscious, and he was so mean about my writing that by the end of the semester, I thought, it was my junior year of college, I was like, well, forget this. I obviously can't write. I obviously don't know how to write, but maybe I can help other people write. So I found my way into the publishing industry by working as an editor and helping to start a couple of very small presses back before indie publishing was a thing. And I did that for quite some time. And then I went to work for an organization that did arts education for youth in need. And while I was there, we were in a meeting, and I was an administrator, right? I wrote grants, I did strategic planning. I was supposedly running this meeting, but if you've ever tried to organize artists, you know, it's like trying to herd a bunch of kittens. It just doesn't work, right? So they weren't listening. And the guitarist, who was a teaching artist sitting next to me, she turned to me and she said, as an arts administrator, you're so organized. This must be so frustrating for you having to deal with us artists. I'm so sorry. And I had this moment of like, oh my gosh, she doesn't have any idea that I used to write, that this was my whole life, that I loved it so much. All she knows is I write grants and do strategic planning and I get money. And so it was this real aha moment. And I knew I could either say, okay, well, I believe in this cause. Writing was the road less traveled. I'm just not going to do it. Or I could say, you know what, if all these kids in need are brave enough to take a chance with their art, don't I kind of owe it to myself and to them to walk the walk and give it a chance? So that's what I did. And I built up my freelance editing career because I work as an editor. I stepped away from my job and I told myself, I'll give this a year. And at the end of the year, I will either have written a book or I won't. And that's what I did. And that book ended up becoming my first novel, The Memory Thief, which hit the New York Times bestseller list and became a Target Emerging Authors pick. And I kind of felt like in your face to that awful teacher who was so mean to me. And so now when I teach writing, I have his voice in my mind all the time as what not to do. And I try so hard always to be encouraging to my students, no matter what point they're at in their writing, because that's proof that, you know, you don't have to listen to instructors who tell you something that doesn't resonate with your inner voice. So yeah, that's my weird backwards journey to writing.
Wonderful. I mean,
that so many times people saying a similar thing about a creative writing teacher. Basically, if you're not writing literary fiction, then why are you bothering? And honestly, I think there's a special circle of hell for those guys. I think it's completely wrong that literary fiction is the only fiction worth writing. And if there are people watching thinking that, then, you know, I really hope that you're going to pick up a pen and write, because it's appalling, dreadful messaging from the teaching community.
And I'm so glad that you said that, Bryony, because I didn't go in with that assumption, and then it was sort of upon me, and it.
Have we lost you, Emily? Okay, so it looks like Emily has frozen.
Am I still?
Oh, she's back.
Oh, back now. So yeah, we lost you for a few seconds there.
I don't know what happened, but yeah, I was just saying it, Bryony. I completely agree, because the teachers don't realize how much power they have, and editors as well. If you hire a freelance editor, to really influence what emerging writers think. And so I still believe what I believed as a college junior walking into that classroom, that good writing is good writing. And we're taught sometimes that genre fiction is a dirty word, but I don't believe that at all. And I think just because something sells well and is marketable, sometimes that becomes a threatening concept rather than being something to celebrate. So I always encourage people to believe in their voice and in themselves.
And the important thing that young people are reading, it doesn't matter if they're not reading Martin Amis or, you know, Brian Greene. It's important that they're reading, and what they want to read is really great, exciting, action-filled adventures, which is what we're writing. And that's most important, isn't it? Get young people reading. There's Absolutely. No point writing dry literary fiction if young people aren't going to pick it up.
Absolutely. I'm going to say one more thing, and then I'm going to go away so that other people can say things. But you just made me think of something else, which is, I can't remember whose seminar this was that I attended where the person said this. It was somebody ages ago, but that they're a writer, whoever this was, and they had worked at a summer camp counselor the year that the third book of the Harry Potter series came out. And of course, we all know all the ways that Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling are now problematic, but setting that just aside to talk about this one aspect of it. So this was before any of that was known, and Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. The book came out, and the counselor didn't realize it was coming out. And she was just at camp. Usually after lunch, everything was extremely loud. Everything was extremely rowdy. You know, it was like the worst time of day. All the kids were all jazzed up. And this one day it was really quiet. All the counselors were so worried. What could be going on? They were so afraid. And they came upon child after child after child, many of them boys who they had not been willing to convince to read earlier in the summer, absorbed in a book. And then even weirder, they all seemed to be absorbed in the same book. And they came to realize that these kids who were away at camp had realized that the third book was coming out in the series and had asked their parents to mail them the book. And the book had all arrived in the same day, and all these kids were reading at camp. And so, you know, that's the power of a good novel and good writing and a fantasy novel to transport kids. And that's why I really just think that if you can get teens and kids reading, that's the most important part, because that's what we all want, is a readership for our work to reach.
I agree with this so much, because I discovered Harry Potter as an adult, or even later after it was all out. And then it just opened up this whole genre and world for me to understand. Like, I used to only get straight literary fiction, and that was what they were producing as audiobooks 15 years ago, because there were very few books being done, you know. And then once the platform started, you know, proliferating, and audiobooks is the fastest growing segment in publishing now, because they can stream and everybody's, you know, well, for all the reasons, you know, it has opened up a lot of this independent writers, people being able to do whatever they want without having to be represented, put their stuff out there, get online, have a fan following. And it's just so prolific that, you know, the publishing industry is like, oh, okay, well, if we don't get in on this, you know, and that's kind of like, you know, come on. But it is this huge amount of readers that just get crazy and wild about all of this. And I think that is, and you know, a really good point that you're all talking about, Emily. And so I only started getting fantasy, and well, not as much fantasy, but let's say thriller and speculative fiction, you know, adult fantasy later, maybe only 6 years ago or something, 7. And so that opened up a whole world. Yeah, obviously I do Asian niche writers and protagonists, which can be limiting sometimes. And, you know, that segment as well, own voices or identity kind of specific, culturally specific fantasy and thriller, speculative, that's only begun to kind of bubble to the surface and be fostered. Authors that are from different backgrounds that aren't necessarily using the same formulas. Or sometimes things become tropes, you know, and wuxia, all these other subgenres are kind of adding to, you know, the whole world, whole fantasy worlds, and all of a sudden atypical characters and, you know, all sorts of different gender identity characters started to pop up so much in the last 5 years. And there's really a need for that, especially for kids and teens. And so it's a good sign.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, because like obviously we all know that representation is just so important. So yeah, Nancy, you started mentioning subgenres there, so I want to build on that a little bit, and I'd love to know what your favorite subgenre within the fantasy sort of bigger genre is and why.
Yeah, you know, I've done a smattering of different things. You know, traditionally I started with, and again, this speaks to what kind of kids' books and middle grade books were being turned into audio, and the Asian ones. So this was very much like dragon fantasies and culturally set in Japan and China, coming from this kind of epic fantasy world, which I actually love epic fantasy, you know. I don't know if Avatar would, maybe that's sort of corresponds to that, based in like old cultural worlds. And like wuxia and silk punk is so cool. I don't get to do enough of that. And that definitely is steeped in Asian cultures as well. So of course, like I have an affinity to kind of look into this and all the, you know, movies from Hong Kong and the mainland that were, you know, really proliferated 15, 20 years ago, being made for young adult stories. So I like silk punk and wuxia. I had never done kind of a horror dystopian book until I did Ling Ma's Severance. This novel, I think, did pretty well. And I was just like, zombies. Wait, this isn't my genre. This is so weird. You know, they're like murdering you and jumping out of, you know, windows, and it's really dark, and it's super dark and creepy and very bloody and, you know, quite serious. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And this got a lot of awards actually. And I was like, when I was reading, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't like, am I doing this right? This is, you know, because things like Stranger Things and the Squid Game coming into our consciousness of what we want to see is, or what's fascinating in terms of like futuristic sci-fi mixed together with fantasy. So yeah, fantasy, yeah, thrillers. And then, you know, as I finally like read up, you know, once I started getting these authors, like, oh, what's the Hugo Award? You know, all these things were super new to me. I suppose would be that a mix of science fiction and fantasy is cool.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I love science fiction and fantasy when it's sort of like merging together. I love the sort of like the extra possibilities that it offers for like world building as well. And we will discuss world building in a lot of detail a bit later on in the panel. But yeah, Jessica, what about you? What's your sort of favorite subgenres within fantasy?
I prefer contemporary fantasy, so books that are set in our world but have like a fantastical twist. I'm also very into horror. It is my favorite genre right now, even though I'm very much a scaredy cat. I can't actually watch horror movies because they scare me so much. But I do like writing it and I do like reading it. Because at least in a book, you can just close the book whenever it gets too scary. So but it's hard to like look away from a screen, so I deal with it much better in books than I do in movies and stuff. But yeah, horror is my favorite, and that's generally what I write as well.
Yeah, I definitely could see a lot of the horror aspects in Bad Witch Burning, particularly. And yeah, I love that book so much, and I'm also a massive horror fan. So soon as we've got horror elements appearing in fantasy and also like supernatural in horror, it's definitely a book that I know I'm going to love. So Bryony, what about you? What's your sort of favorite subgenre of fantasy?
Well, I grew up reading traditional epic, really. Feist, David Gemmell, Mickey Zucker-Reichardt, that sort of thing. What I really loved was Anne McCaffrey, her Pern series, which is that mix of science fiction and fantasy. The dragons, but set on another planet. It was fantastic. And she was the writer that really got me wanting to write like her. I completely agree with fantasy horror. Stephen King's one of my favourites, and I would argue that his Dark Tower series is fantasy rather than horror. And I find that a lot of his books, things like Eyes of the Dragon, that's pure fantasy, and his books tend to have happy endings. The bad guy tends to be defeated, and to me, that's fantasy rather than horror. But what I've been reading a lot of recently is urban fantasy, or what Jessica called contemporary fantasy. And, I really enjoy things like the Elemental Assassin series, that sort of thing. And the one that I've written, Raising Hell, is very much an urban fantasy set in London with these supernatural creatures. So yeah, I'm a bit of I dip in and out. I've been reading a lot of Mark Lawrence recently, The Red Sister, marvelous. Bridget Khmer, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, sorry. Sarah J Maas, my daughter's obsessed with her, but I found her first. Kathleen Dewey, Skin Hunger, Sacred Skies, that sort of thing. So yeah, I tend to lean towards epic, I think, but yeah, I'd never turned down a fantasy of any genre, really.
Of course, right. And Emily, what about you?
I think I tend to lean towards urban fantasy really strongly. I keep thinking about what it is that draws me to that, because I certainly have enjoyed reading epic fantasy in my time, but there's just something about our world but different, like a reimagined version of our world that just draws me to it. I guess maybe it's because I imagine, okay, our world could be that if only this had happened, or if only that had happened, or what would my daily life be like if we inserted this variable into it. I love anything that has ghosts in it. I'm a huge fan of ghosts or veils between worlds. I love that. I do love a good portal fantasy, like the 10,000 Doors of January. Like, I loved that. Bryony, I've been on the bandwagon for many years about the Dark Tower series and how that's fantasy versus horror, although he does end up dumping all of his other books into it at one point, where, okay, I don't know what this is now. It is a soup. He's made a soup. But I love that series. It's definitely, when I teach workshops on first lines, that first line of the whole series, the man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed. I love that first line. So yeah, I do like to read Gothic stuff as well. I'm a sucker for anything Gothic, especially, once you throw in a healthy dose of romance in there. So yeah, that's kind of my jam. It's kind of what I love.
Wonderful. And I love Gothic as well. Like, yesterday I was moderating the Gothic fiction panel for YA Thrillercon, and yeah, like Gothic, anything sort of like ghostly, it's the atmosphere that I really like in Gothic fiction. And when that's sort of brought into fantasy as well, and sort of like edging towards horror, like that's my favorite sort of fantasy. So yeah, obviously we've sort of like touched a bit on world building, and world building is so important in any fantasy work. So let's talk a bit about what makes effective world building.
That's his last line as well.
I don't know if we've lost Bryony. I think we've got a delay with the internet, but yeah. So if we start talking about world building and what makes effective world building, so Emily, would you like to kick us off with this one?
Sure. Just unmuting myself there. I think for me, I sometimes think that the details is where world building really comes alive for me. Because yes, you do have to set up the world well. You do have to give us a strong understanding of the consistent rules and laws of whatever magic system that you're setting up so that we understand what is and what is not possible. That's a big deal. I think being able to truly use all five senses when you're setting up the world building so that it doesn't feel wooden, that we feel completely immersed in it. We know what it smells like, looks like, feels like. I think as a writer, when I'm doing world building, like, for example, for my Seven Sins series, I requested that an artist friend of myself and Maddie draw a map for me. And she drew and illustrated this map, and it was an illustration of the whole world that I created. So I could really see, okay, how far is this from this? How long would it reasonably take them to walk there from here? You know, can I always identify this as sounding and looking the same way at the same time? Really maintaining that consistency. The other thing with world building, I think, is that there's a distinction of if you're just making up the world entirely in your mind, that gives you a lot of freedom, versus if your world is inspired by something else. And so if your world has been inspired by something else, then you really need to think about, okay, why did I choose this something else? Was this the right choice? What role is the someplace else or the something else playing in my story? Was it important to choose this? And then once I've chosen this, then how is this informing every other aspect of the world that I've created? The food, the clothing, the mores, the religion, the conflicts, the war. I once heard in another panel that I listened to once, someone, it might have been even Lee Bardugo at Y'all Fest, but somebody said something about, you know, to really think about the trade routes in the worlds that you set up and how they get their food and how they grow their crops and how the commerce system works. Because once you understand those pieces of the world, you're going to understand so much more, because we as societies grow up in a certain way, you know, with certain needs and certain political conflicts based on our access to food and water and goods. And I had never really thought about it that way. But, you know, once you set up all the big picture stuff, for me with world building, you got to have a through line in your mind. You cannot do your world building in pieces or in a vacuum. Everything that you write, every choice that your character makes, how they live, what they believe, how they react, what they eat, who they worship, who they hate, who they fight, who they're drawn towards, is all created by this world that you build. And so for me, I would say, you know, once you set up this world in this way, you've got to really think through the ripple effects of the implications, because only then will it really ring true for your reader.
Yeah, that's such good advice. And you raised so many important parts and components of the world that us as writers have to consider when we're creating a brand new world. So, Jessica, I'm really interested to know your thoughts on this, particularly when you write contemporary fantasy, where you've already got sort of like the world sort of as it exists in contemporary fiction, when you're infusing these fantasy elements into it. So what tips do you have for doing this?
Okay, so I was afraid of this question because world building is like the hardest thing for me. My editors are always yelling at me. They're like, you have to do this, you have to do this. And I'm like, I'm so sorry. This is like the worst part of the book for me. But it's a little bit easier in contemporary because we already have a framework for you know, how the world works. So it's much easier for me to build off of what's already there than for me to try to make it up completely from scratch. But with Bad Witch Burning in particular, I am also of the mind that magic shouldn't really have to be explained, which also gets me in trouble with my editor sometimes. But for me, if you take the magic out of magic, then it's just science. So in Bad Witch Burning, my main character can talk to ghosts. And so originally my editor was like, well, why can she talk to ghosts? Can you tell me more about how she discovered this? Can you give me a backstory? And I'm like, no, because it's magic. Like, all you need to know is that she talks to ghosts. Like, I shouldn't have to explain. It's like I shouldn't have to explain how rainbows work in the sky, or like why it rains or why it's cloudy. Like, it's just a part of her world. And that's my personal feelings about it. But it's like the difference between a hard magic system and a soft magic system. I'm very much of the mind that it should be soft, that magic should just be magic, and then you can kind of get into the nitty gritty later if you need to. But I think a little bit of mystery and intrigue is good, so it'll leave your reader something to think about. But that's my personal opinion. I very admire you, Emily, for doing what you do, because I can't do that. So.
Oh, well, I wouldn't say that it necessarily comes naturally to me either. It's just that I get in trouble if I don't keep my stuff consistent. And so I had never written a series before I wrote my Seven Sins series. And, when I started to write book 3, I realized that I had not set up a series Bible, and I had not written anything down. And I realized that I needed to go back through and read everything through to make sure that I kept it consistent. And so that for me is why I begged my artist friend to draw the visual rendition of the world, just so I could keep it consistent for my readers, because that series has got, it's got 3 books plus a short story collection, plus a short story or novella. And so I was like, what the heck did I say about where these people are and what they do? And just keeping it all straight. I didn't want to let the reader down or confuse them or have to retcon myself. So but it doesn't necessarily completely come easy for me at all, which is why I think were I to do this again for world building, I'd go back and document all my stuff from the start instead of having to do it backwards.
I just want to jump in on this. I think it's very important because I read so many books and I perform them. So, it's kind of like inspecting. When the narrator is lost and doesn't know why this or why that, then I think you're in trouble, because I can't just skip over the parts that don't make sense or like, okay, whatever, and just move through. I have to like sell it. I have to create that for the person. And if the details are not there and you're just like, well, all of a sudden, why can they do that? And not necessarily like magic stuff. Maybe sometimes the magic needs to be explained a little bit more, like what patterns happen and why this person can do this and that person can't do this. I want to know that. Science fiction for sure, otherwise you don't get any buy-in. People you can't suspend their disbelief for that long. And a lot of times I've had questions to the author, and I've seen very good world building and very bad world building, and I'm just not invested. I can't be. I just confused myself. If you like what Emily was saying, if you don't keep that Bible straight and you don't have the timeline straight and something mismatches, you're just going to throw it away. I can't believe you. And it does have to be consistent, especially if you have a series going. Is if you drop that, and it's throughout this thing that you're dropping in little clues, and it's not like exposition about that thing. It's about this thing happened, and then there's a little, you drop in the world. How does that, ecosystem work? What about the politics? Where do they get the food from? What does the land look like? Little bits inform. And I think if you go too heavy on the real personal relationships, and then it goes back to like plot and what they're doing, you lose the sense of where they're living. And it's just, you don't get that piece, which I think is important for a fantasy, science fiction world. Then it just kind of becomes your standard kind of romance or your standard kind of like adventure thing. There are some books that I could reference where it's just like, whoa, that's an amazing concept. And it's also, I think, when you get to the tropes where it's like time travel or, I don't know, all the things, if you're going to go a different way as to why that magic works, why the time travel is working that way, or you're going to have to explain it, because otherwise it's fine if you're referencing things that kind of already people have an idea about. Oh, that's how this works. And you're talking about, black holes and parallel universe and relativity. Then I think that that's what's exciting. Certainly in science fiction for adults, that stuff better be solid, because people are smart and they're just going to test that. But if it is fantasy, pure fantasy and fiction, and for young adults, that's different. as well. Like, what are they interested in and why? You know, like what pieces of the fantasy world are just compelling, you know, and you dive in to that. And yeah, I think like the Avatar world does a great job, but that's like a franchise that was developed so heavily for Nickelodeon. And then the 3 books that I've narrated, I just finished the 3rd one. That writer, Christian Yee, FC Yee, he's a friend of mine, so I just kind of plug it. He's done an amazing job. Like, why the fans are able to stay with him after the original founders have set their whole world is that he takes that stuff and brings new things in, new characters, new plot points, even new magic or new abilities. He fills out like what is earthbending and why, or like airbending and that world. He just like adds little pieces. And if you know, if you do that, it's kind of like you just draw people in more. And I think that is important if you're going to be very much outside of our world.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that 100%. So, Bryony, what are your thoughts on effective world building when we're creating these fantasy worlds?
Probably a lot of it's been covered. I think it's very important to set out your rules and stick to them. You need to know them, and it's useful for your reader to know them as well. But in terms of like writing a convincing world, I think one of the important things when writing fantasy is to almost imagine that you're not writing a fantasy world. So, for example, as a mentor, I recently had a writer send one in where they were describing, you know, this person basically switches on a light, and they were describing how the light switches on and the stuff that's in the light that makes it work and all the rest of it. And I said, you know, imagine you were writing a contemporary fiction, someone comes in and switches on the light. You don't then start talking about filaments and electricity and all the rest of it. Someone just switches on a light. And it should be the same in a fantasy world. Things that to the character are normal everyday things, you should write about them as if they're normal everyday things. And that then is what feels real to the reader. You know, someone in a fantasy world wouldn't be gobsmacked about how the light's working, whether it's lighting a torch or using a flint or magical orbs or whatever. To them it would just be the light. So, you know, it's all about describing the things in the fantasy world that are the equivalents to what you would describe in contemporary fiction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
That then makes it very real. It means the characters move through the world in a way that feels very convincing. So, you know, the other stuff that I would say about world building, you know, there's a fantastic fantasy world building questionnaire. I'll pop it on Twitter later. That is written by I can't remember who wrote it. But basically it's just pages of questions that you can fill in for your fantasy world, everything from education system to flora and fauna to do they barter or use money, or, you know, the financial system, the religious system, the politics, you know, how they travel around, absolutely everything in this questionnaire. So it's very useful.
Yeah, definitely. That questionnaire sounds wonderful, because I guess like it's all about taking your world seriously and making it as authentic and realistic to you and to your character as the real world is. And yeah, just approaching it in the same sort of way. I love what you were saying about how your main character, if something's normal for them in that fantasy world, but they're not going to spend time explaining it because it's just going to be completely normal. So yeah, that's such a good tip. So yeah, now as we've sort of like talked about world building, obviously we're going to need characters to put in our world when we're creating these fantasy stories. So Bryony, would you like to kick us off here about how you create an effective protagonist within your fantasy world?
Oh my God, that is an hour-long creative writing class you just asked me to do, by the way. So for me, a lot of it is about backstory, knowing who they are and how they got to the situation, or what they think is going on, what their hopes and dreams are, what their greatest fears are, you know, answering those questions about that character, you know, what's their biggest secrets, you know, help you to build up that person. And then I also tend to give them a very consistent sort of 2 strengths and a fatal flaw, and aim to have scenes reinforce their strengths or flaw. And then, I mean, there's lots of other stuff that I do, but I think for me, I mean, for example, with Raising Hell, I did a lot of work on character backstory. You know, I have a short story about the character backstory, what happened after the rift was opened, and how she you know, how the government treated her, and but the story doesn't start until later. You know, the story starts with her, the rift's already open, there's magic in the world, and she's running school security. But, you know, I know what happened in the run up to that. The reader might not, but I do. And I think that's a lot of what makes a convincing character, you as the writer knowing them so well. And the other thing is to say, not just to do that for your main character, do that for your secondary characters as well, to make them very real. And in particular, and I think this is something a lot of people forget, to do it for the antagonist, because the antagonist also needs to be a very real person. And the antagonist will believe themselves to be the hero, and your hero is their antagonist, you know. And if you can work out how that story works, I think you will have a really good, strong fantasy narrative, or any narrative, actually.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Yeah, Nancy, I'm intrigued to hear your thoughts on this, particularly when you're narrating multiple stories, and you're going to be sort of more connecting to some main characters, some protagonists than others. So have you noticed that there's any sort of pattern in the way that these characters are created that makes them stronger or more effective for you, both as a reader and a narrator? Oh, I think you're still on mute, so we can't hear you yet.
So protagonists and antagonists and the characters?
Yeah.
I think that people lose interest a lot when the character is not likable, the protagonist. And generally there's kind of like, well, I don't know about patterns that much. I'm not a big, I read what I read. I read for a living. I'm like 4 books of all these different, I'm not a huge reader or audiobook listener in my current life. And I was not growing up, to be honest. But from what I'm exposed to, and, you know, I do my research on the books that I get, it's like, you know, of course I'm doing female protagonists mostly. And when the person becomes like, you know, you get too involved in the romance, it's always like, you know, we don't want that. You know, it's got to be a nice balance, because that element's part of it for YA. If the protagonist gets to, you know, annoying or whiny, or keeps going over the same thing chapter after chapter and doesn't solve that problem. I don't know. Am I speaking to the question, actually? I'm not sure.
Yeah, definitely. Because I mean, you're pointing out things that will help readers relate to certain characters or not connect with them. And obviously, when we're writing these books, we want readers to be able to connect, even if they don't necessarily like the main character.
Yes.
I still like how, even if it's an unlikable main character, I still understand their motivations. So I still sort of like respect.
Sorry, all these little flies are around me. So really what you were getting to is the character arc, right? That's the most important part, where they overcome these. Why are you around me, little flies outside? So in what I experience is like, that person's really got to overcome that character flaw and that weakness. And if it's not done kind of early enough, or the seeds aren't dropped early enough that there's a potential for it, or like that it will pay off there, you're with her rooting for them to make that, to strengthen in that way, then you're going to lose them too early. And then you're going to have to, then you're set in the beginning of the book being like, why should I continue on with this? And the same for the antagonist, I think, for sure, because generally a lot of times these two come together, right, in the end. And that's kind of like understanding the other whether there's a resolution as to their friends or they continue to be like, you know, like enemies. We have to really, the good ones that I've read and that we've gotten awards for really does split it down the middle and give life to both of those sides. And you flesh that out. But yeah, I guess that's what I would say.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's great. Great to hear your perspective on it. And like the advice that you give, like, it's of course equally important to flesh out the antagonist as a protagonist, which both you and Bryony have spoken about, particularly as their goals, like the goal of each of these characters are likely to be in opposition to each other. So yeah, I mean, when I'm creating my protagonists, I always create them at the same time as my antagonists. Remember, they will both contrast with each other, but also complement each other in the different ways, and when I pay attention to that as I'm writing as well. So Jessica, what are your thoughts on creating effective protagonists and antagonists too within your fantasy worlds?
Well, Bryony and Nancy said pretty much everything I wanted to say, but I will speak on just the fact that a character doesn't have to be likable, but they do have to be understandable. So my main character from Bad Witch Burning, Cottrell, there actually is no antagonist because she is her own worst enemy. And she goes through so much, and she's very not like a traditional hero. She's very selfish sometimes. She can be bullheaded sometimes. She doesn't listen to her friends' advice a lot. She feels like she has to do things on her own a lot. But I mean, I hope that I have conveyed Cottrell in a way that you understand her. You understand why she's like that. And you're rooting for her to change, but you also are a little afraid that she won't, because she's been on this path for so long that it's so hard to turn back. And I just feel like with a character like that, especially, you have to do the groundwork. Like Bryony was saying, you have to know them very well. You as the author have to be like their best friend. Like, you have to know them. And I also find that putting a little bit of yourself into your character helps. So in my middle grade series, the main character, very unlike Cottrell, but she has social anxiety, and then I also have social anxiety. So it was easier for me to connect with that character because I put a piece of myself in her. And I think that's a good tip. But you want to be careful not to put too much of yourself in the character, because then it just becomes self-insert. But also, it can be very difficult to edit sometimes if you put if you mirror yourself too much, because then it feels like your editor is critiquing you and not the character, which is very unpleasant. So just be careful with that. But yeah, I think a lot of people have already said what my process is, which is to just get to know the character very well and then move from there.
Yeah, definitely. What you're saying about not putting too much of yourself into your characters as well, I definitely agree with, because I often put too much of myself into my characters, and I found that I often write for escapism. So like, I'm disabled, chronically ill, and I like to write characters who can do the things that I can't actually do anymore. But then I also feel like this almost pressure to write characters that also have the same disabilities as me. And I found that when I do that, I feel that I'm not getting the escapism from my writing as well. And then I'm not as invested in the story. So it's really important for me now, when I am writing these own voices story, to get the balance right, so that I still feel this connection and motivation to keep writing the character. So yeah, I agree with what you were saying 100%. And Emily, let's come to you. So is there anything else that you'd like to add when we're talking about character creation?
Sure. Well, you know, I have this whole class that I'm doing on this tomorrow, my plot plus character equals story class. And so one thing that I would like to say is that I think, you know, sometimes people can get very into plotting methods if they're not discovery writers or pantsers or whatever you want to say. And I always try to caution my students that without a really strong character with a very strong arc, plot is meaningless, right? Plot just sort of marches forward, and you can have the most interesting things happening in the world, but if we don't care about who they're happening to, it's not going to matter. So I always do ask myself these very kind of specific questions starting out, even when I'm doing my plot, because even if I'm writing something that's going to be action-packed and very heavily plot-based, who the character is and what happens to them and their backstory is going to so completely dictate their reaction in a given situation, which in turn will drive the plot forward, which in turn will dictate their action or reaction, which in turn will drive the plot. So the questions I always ask myself when I start out, as I'm plotting my story, even before I plot, is, okay, what does my character want? What's their goal? But also, why do they want it? Why is this one thing, the thing that they want so much that this whole story can be dedicated to it? And then I think, okay, I know what they want. I know why they want it. Why can't they just have it? Because you need conflict to make a story go. So if your character could just have the thing that they wanted, no one would read onward, right? So what are the obstacles and how can I increase these obstacles over the course of the story, making that mountain higher and higher to climb so that my character is going to have to fight harder and harder to get it. And then I start really to think about their arc. And for me, I then think about what is this character's greatest flaw? Sometimes people will call it their greatest fear, their ghost, or their essential wound. I've heard it called all of that. In my brain, I make it simple. What's their flaw? What is this thing that they just cannot get around? And it's got to be something that messes up every aspect of their life, especially where they need to get to in our story. But it needs to be a big deal and something that they can't see. Something usually that someone else points out to them, like a best friend or someone at the beginning of the story, a coworker. They're like, I don't do that. That's not a problem. But of course it is. It's a big problem, right? And then I think, okay, if this is their big old flaw, what trauma happened to them? What's the big awful thing or series of things that happened to them to make them this way, right? And then I think, okay, what's this character's core misbelief? What do they believe about who they are, how they need to live their life, how other people work, or how the world works? It's just not true, but they believe it. And they believe it so firmly because of this terrible trauma or series of traumas that have happened to them and their flaw that they have as a result. And then how my character needs to grow as a result is usually in direct opposition to that flaw, assuming that we're not talking about someone who has sort of a villain arc and then it's, the reverse, their worst beliefs are confirmed, et cetera, et cetera. For example, in The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which is the Hunger Games prequel, we see President Snow's origin story. He doesn't get better as the book goes on, he gets worse. But he gets worse because all of his worst core misbeliefs that goes in the opposite direction, they get confirmed. If you're not writing that kind of a book, if you're not writing a villain origin story, then those beliefs are usually contradicted, not in a trite way, but in a way that truly shows growth. And what I have found is when I get stuck in my plotting, or if I'm not plotting at the moment, if I'm just doing discovery writing, it's usually because I cannot answer these questions about my characters succinctly in 2 or fewer sentences. And so I go back to all of this and figure it out. And I find that my plot and my character development are just so completely intertangled and enmeshed.
Yeah, I mean, you've illustrated perfectly there just how important it is for us to be reading these other novels that have these really effective characters. And when we come across these characters that we are really drawn to, whether they're protagonist or antagonist, whatever their core beliefs are, just to think about why we're having this sort of response to them, why we feel that they're very effective, and to analyze and work out exactly how the author has produced this impact for us. And then it's those sort of things that then we can then incorporate into our own writing and making our characters even more effective and relatable, have a deeper connection, or be more understandable. So yeah, like the psychology of character building is something that I'm really, really interested in. And obviously we need to like read other authors' work as well to see how others have done it and just sort of like soak up all the information. So talking on this, what is the one novel that you would recommend, a fantasy novel, to a reader perhaps who is new to the fantasy genre? So you've got to sort of like give them the best example that you know. So we'll quickly get through these answers because we are coming up to the end of the panel now. So Nancy, which novel would you recommend?
My goodness. I just recently am going to be doing a third in a series by Ada Hoffman. So she did her first book, The Outside, and I thought it was excellent. Definitely a complete new world built, mix of science fiction and fantasy. The second book is called Fallen. I don't know when the third is going to be coming out. I don't know if you guys know her. Them. Sorry. Know them. And I really like more of a traditional kind of YA. Renee Adier, I did a series of hers, which was cool. This was the Flame in the Mist series. Yeah, well, there's many. I did a bunch of Neon Yang books, JY Neon Yang and Zen Cho, and that again is more the swoosha silk punk type of thing. But just some favorites that stuck out. Marie Lu for more science fiction type of urban fantasy.
Well, thank you for those recommendations. I'm probably gonna rewatch this after we finish this panel, just so I can note down all the recommendations for all the different books that you're saying that we should definitely read. So, Jessica, what's the one book that you would recommend for this question?
Oh gosh, I can't just pick one. But I'll be quick. Wings of Ebony by JL. Really love that book, and JL is such a really good friend of mine. And then there's another one that's not out yet, and I did a blurb for it, but it's called How to Succeed in Witchcraft by Iceland Brophy. And that book was just incredible. It was the perfect blend of contemporary and fantasy, like right down the middle, just perfect. And then real quick, my two favorite horror books were The River Has Teeth by Erica Waters and The Dead in the Dark by Courtney Gold. So sorry, that's 4, but
that's great recommendations. I love both those horror novels that you've recommended, so I'm definitely going to check out the fantasy ones that you have advocated for. Emily, what about you?
I couldn't possibly do just one, and I have so many that I wrote down, but I think that one of my favorites, which sort of continues now with Call Down the Hawk, is Maggie Stiefvater's Raven Cycle. I love those books. I think they're atmospheric and beautiful, and she's a visual artist and a musician, and you can really see that as it comes through on the page. And that is one thing that I've always loved about her writing, is that her multidisciplinary artistic approach really comes through it in her prose. So I love that. I just read V.E. Schwab's book Gallant, which I would describe as Coraline meets the Secret Garden, and it is just amazing. I loved it. Listened to it on audiobook. Speaking of audiobook, Nancy, and I listened to it as I was on a long road trip, and it was fantastic. And I love Neil Gaiman. I adore him. Almost anything by Neil Gaiman I love. The Ocean at the End of the Lane is a really fantastic one. And when I was growing up, Madeline L'Engle, I still love her books. They're what got me into YA fantasy. So yeah, I have to give a plug for her.
Wonderful. Bryony, are you still here? I don't know if your internet has now dropped out, but if you can still hear us, I'd love to know what book you would recommend. Okay, I guess that your internet isn't working anymore. So yeah, we'll just finish up the panel now then. So a huge thank you to all the panelists for joining me today. It's been such an informative and really interesting discussion about fantasy, and so delighted to be able to talk to you. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
It was a great conversation. I'm so glad to have met all of you. And I'm going to look at these books.
Absolutely. And Jessica,